All right, folks, this is going to be your only lecture for this week, so we're going to pack it with content and hilarity. So you'll recall that you reminded yourself already that this week you have a few different due dates. We're doing things a little differently. Your Prezi outline is going to be due on the 2nd at the end of day. And we're going to ask you to put that in the discussion board. We just made a forum for that. Your peer review of the Prezis will be due the next day, which you'll do through the discussion board as well. And we have explicit instructions for that, which you'll see momentarily. And then the final paper is due on the 5th, the day after Independence Day. So what we're going to do right now is a little bit of a review of what is going to happen with the paper. We're going to look back at some of your questions, and we're also going to look back at what we've been trying to teach you these many weeks and how it contributes to this final assignment.
Yeah, and your questions are really good because they're reminding us of places where you guys are clearly seeing how what we've done leads to certain patterns, but also where we want to reinforce how what we've done is leading to this paper, because we really do want you to see this final paper as sort of a culmination of the steps that we've been doing and thinking about how those fit together into a larger argument. So this will be the only formal lecture that you have this week, or this couple of screencasts that we are putting together. But we do want to remind you guys, first of all, that there is a ask us a question discussion board place, and that you get an extra credit point for every question that you ask. So that's double points there, right? That you would get a useful answer and extra points. And also that we are available by email to set up a Skype consultation, whatever it does, to work on these different steps of what we're doing. I think we've made this clear, but I just want to say it because I like to repeat things. The Prezi outline is really a way to think through what your paper is going to do, and that should look very similar to what you've been doing and what we've been doing all along, right? It probably won't be as fully developed with long applications, but it's a place to say, well, here's my data, here's what I'm thinking about doing with it, here's why it matters. And that's really going to serve as an outline for what you're going to write by thinking about how the different shapes that we've been talking about, applications, data collations, etc., so what's encounters, fit together to make a larger mega so what. And we're gonna remind you of the ways that we've been doing that consistently in modeling our lectures as well, the ways that you guys have picked that up in a little bit. But first, we do want to talk a little bit about the peer review of those Prezi outlines, just what questions we want you to answer and that sort of stuff, just to answer any sort of logistical questions you might have.
Yeah, so if you want to think of the Prezi outline as almost like a modular outline, instead of having to be in this kind of linear order, it's in a spatial order, so you can move things around and decide, wow, if I put this first, this suddenly becomes much more interesting. Our hope is that using the Prezi will give you more freedom to think about your paper in that way.
And I think you guys have been starting to realize that already is, when you get to your application, you might be like, oh, really what I want to do with my right to learn was this. This is really just taking that, the flexibility that we've been swearing to you is incumbent in this method, and really taking it to its utmost and showing how you can really just move things around literally by taking that square and taking it to different places. So it's hopefully kind of fun. Dr. Watson and I have been playing around with this technique, and it's really changed how we're thinking about our own writing and thinking about how we can move things around. And so hopefully you're going to start to get sort of in the way that anyone can have the fun of writing a final paper in a week in a summer course, but sort of get some of the excitement that these sort of approaches generate.
That was an exciting transition. Now we want to look at the discussion board forum we put up for your Prezi outlines to go into. So you can see it here. It's now on the top. It's called Prezi outlines. And there are, if you notice, 5 questions here, because 2 gets also a letter with it. But this is what you're going to do with each other's Prezi outlines.
Yeah, and part of the point of peer review, the reason we give very sort of specific questions is I think otherwise it's really easy to sort of go into the, oh, I like you and your ideas, and that's not the most useful thing. One of the things you may find, honestly, is that the most useful part of this peer review is it makes you go back and look at your own paper as if somebody else were reading it, which of course is massively important to understand where people might have difficulty. So, and that really is why question 4 is in some ways the most important part of this thing. What would you steal from this for your own paper? Because we're hoping that by looking at, say, you see how somebody else creates an encounter between two ideas that sets up a really interesting so what. That's going to be what makes you realize, oh, I need to go back to my own paper and put this encounter here or do whatever that is. You may also find, and I just don't like to ask this in as negative a way, but you may find, wow, I was really confused about how they move from step A to step B, and it made me realize that my reader would have the same kind of confusion in moving from step A to step B, so I need to go back and fix that. So one great thing that peer review can do, I think, is to get you to think about how a peer would review your own paper. And have you change things that way. But each of these questions is really set up to get how a reader is experiencing the paper. That's really the biggest thing that peer review does, because what happens, and you've seen this probably in our own responses to your applications, is you've been thinking so hard about something or in such detail that you've got these great ideas, but you might not recognize how it might be difficult for someone coming in new to those ideas to see them and experience them. What peer review can do is sort of show how a reader is going through the act of reading your paper. Now, in this case, there's not a paper, there's just the set of ideas and how they intersect to each other. So you've really already stripped it down to the bones. So the comments that you get back, hopefully, are going to be useful as to how people are experiencing those connections and where they might still need other connections.
Yeah, and I think the peer review, in addition to giving you those specific ways of thinking about audience, should give you more of the kind of flexibility that we really hope this Prezi technique, the Prezi outline technique, gives to a writing process.
Another smooth transition there. This should hopefully look familiar to you. This is one of the very first Prezis that you watch, this A to Z method, and we're asking you to go back and watch that again. Again, you can of course go to instructor presentations and just click on the link there. For a couple of reasons. One is we just really want to remind you how everything fits together that we've been doing, right? These should look awfully familiar, the data collations, the applications, the so what's, the encounters that we've been asking you to write and do all along. But we also really want you to think about how they fit together into a solid stream, but also how they move around. Particularly, I think this is going to help to address the questions that David and Liz asked us this week, which both to some extent are about like creating some sort of grand unifying idea or big idea. One of the things we want to remind you is that part of the whole point of the A to Z method is that those big ideas are often not particularly useful ideas, right? In a sense, they're almost like the big five, the pre-scripted ideas that we're always looking to create more specific answers to. And so this is just a reminder of how we look for specificity and what that specificity comes from, which is usually this movement from a data collation to an application to a so what to an encounter of some sort, but also to remind you that these don't always come in the same order, right? That even though we've been doing them in a kind of a linear stream, that there's a lot of different ways that you can move around between them and that they might interact with each other to get to that specific idea. I think this in some ways also helps to approach Tiffany's question. She's saying, is this just a compare and contrast that we're asking you? Yes and no. I think we are sort of pulling away from the term compare and contrast, because often that might say like, you know, oh, take a fish and a banana and tell me how they're alike and how there's different, and there's no real reason for doing that. But of course we are going to be looking at, say, two sets of things and the encounter between them. The encounter really sets up a compare and contrast to say, why are we looking particularly at the details with this? Now, of course, what we're asking you to do in the paper is to take one set of ideas from an application that you've already built that's helped you get to some sort of so what about literacy and its value in a particular work of literature, and also then do an analysis of some language that you see is collated in the Common Core about literacy and get to some sort of so what that it has about literacy and what it does. And then in between those two, there's an encounter, right? There is a compare and contrast then, but it's a compare and contrast not from some giant set of data collations, but rather a compare and contrast between two specific so what's that's going to drive why you're looking at these two things together. And so it is a compare and contrast, but I think we're calling it an encounter because we're looking for the specificity that sets up. So again, go back to this presentation, which of course is under instructor presentations. Listen to it again, remind yourself of how far you've come, but also about the way these things fit together. So again, hopefully this looks familiar. This is the body part of the Jane Austen lecture from 2 weeks ago. And again, we'd ask that you'd go back and listen to how we walk through these steps. But we want to do a couple of things with this lecture. One thing is we're specifically answering Bethany's question here, right? Which was a question about, do I have to go in the same order as I've been taken through in the collation, or dump collation, right to learn application? And the answer is absolutely not, and we've been trying to model that for you the last couple of weeks. So you can see here that actually we don't follow that order at all, though we definitely still have the shapes, and we think about how those shapes go into detail. And we're going to, or connect to each other. We're going to talk about that in just a second. The other thing that we want to do here is show, answering more in terms of David and Liz's questions as well as Tiffany's about what are we really doing here, show how we actually get to those specific ideas, how we get to those sort of big so whats. You'll see that the encounter on the far right side is really sort of the driving set of questions that this paper might be answering, right? And that each of these so whats then would be the sort of mega so what to one sort of set of questions. You'll also notice that that's not the first thing that appears, though it might be the first thing that you want to set up in your introduction. And so talking about how we get there, rather than thinking that you have to start with this brilliant idea, is part of what we've been working through with all these steps of the template. But first, let's just talk about order more generally.
So the big question is, do you have to go in the order that the outline shows you? And one of the great things about the outline is it can provide quite an order. So in this case, we started off with these two data collations. We came up with this application, which led us into a bunch of questions. We didn't show these separately as an encounter, but here we have a whole set of encounters that this application of Brantlinger to Austin led us into. Okay, and from there that led us back to this data collation and all the way over here to these other encounters. One of which we chose to follow down this way to this deeper encounter, the question of narrative guidance and the way different authors use the narrative voice to direct the reader, which sent us back to a data collation and finally out to a so what. So that's one thing that I think we tried to show you a couple weeks ago with this lecture, but one of the things that makes this a particularly powerful way of outlining a paper is that might not be the best way, and it's certainly not the only way to organize this information in a paper. So you might decide after looking at your outline that actually a so what that you reach 3/4 of the way through the process is really the place to start your paper, and then to move backwards from there into some other questions that are raised and some other data that creates other interesting encounters. So there are multiple possibilities here for papers, and we want you to maintain that kind of flexibility with this.
Yeah, and one thing I think of is that just because an arrow is pointing one way, usually the arrow is pointing that way because that's how you sort of thought process it through. But you might want to think of any arrow in here as reversible. So for instance, I might start at the so what that we've got our arrow on, this blank so what, right? And I might then reverse the arrow back out to the larger encounter, which would then take me to this more specific encounter. And now I'm following my arrows. But you can see how, like, by maybe moving my arrows around, I might be able to take the reader through it in a way that makes more sense to the reader. And of course, that's the kind of questions that we're asking you on your peer review. How, as a reader, are you experiencing how these things fit together? And again, the cool thing here is because these are modular, is that you could then, once you've done that, like actually move them so you could then see, oh, here's how things fit together. Or, yeah, no, in fact, I've got 2 points that are leading to a major point, so I've got to make sure to balance those things out. Again, for me, because we know that those encounters, those big questions, are really what guide the paper, and so what is the answer to those questions, I might be thinking about starting on that bracket on the far right side with those big encounters, even though that's one of the things I came to later in my paper itself, starting from there and then tracing out how those arrows might do it. The one thing you do want to keep in mind, though, is that it's very difficult to make a move from non-arrow connected things, right? So I wouldn't want to start at this triangle at the very bottom and then suddenly leap over to the application there, because there's a lot of steps that connect in between there. So going back and forth between those without those arrows will probably leave your reader a little confused. Instead, I want to backtrace my arrows to show how, starting from this data collation, I could get back to that application.
Or another way to approach the same problem might be, if you're sort of if you've really got the skills with this, is you might figure out there's a hidden encounter between this triangle and this application. And that's, I think, where some of the sort of really dazzling moves in writing come out sometimes, where somebody starts with two things and you don't understand how they're going to be connected, and they show you in sort of a spectacular way that they are connected, beyond what you ever thought was possible.
And this brings us to the second point that we promised to do with this lecture, right? Which is what we're calling the hidden encounter, right? And this again, I think, goes back to David and Liz's questions about whether we need to have this overarching grand idea, and also even to Tiffany's question about, are we just doing the compare and contrast? Because essentially, the hidden encounters are what the specificity comes from, right? And you'll notice that there's an encounter between almost every single shape in here. We might not have clearly done it for instance in the application. We just asked a number of questions afterwards, but those were actually encounters that led to that data collation. You'll notice that there's even an encounter between an encounter, right? So we have a big encounter, then we have a smaller encounter that leads to another data collation. So in a sense, you can think that anytime you connect two shapes, circles, rectangles, squares, there's usually some sort of bracket